When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject, Ragman. User, DearX. Posted, August 2nd, 1997.
As long as I've lived here, and I've lived in this town my entire life, no one has been able to remember the Ragman's real name. I've met a few folks, most of them old-timers, whiling away their golden years atop bar stools at the VFW, who'll swear up and down they knew his family, but when you push them, there's nothing new. Not a single one can describe his parents to you, what they were like, or what they did for work. That information, like what's written on his birth certificate, resides only within the Ragman himself, shuffling around town, pushing his shopping cart full of plastic bottles and trash. And he doesn't talk. Well, I can't tell you what his real name is. I can tell you that we call him Ragman because of the clothes he wears, a heavy cloth coat and tattered blue jeans, replaced Ship of Theseus style over time with squares of filthy fabric until nothing of the original garments was left. Because of the grime, it's hard to see the different squares except in the broadest strokes, a corporate logo here, some houndstooth there. Maybe if you got closer you could make out more, it's just that you wouldn't want to. From the grit under his fingernails to the knit cap pushed down hard over his frizzy, unwashed hair, the Ragman doesn't only look dirty, he feels dirty. It's like he exudes an aura of uncleanliness that might never leave you if you inhaled it too deeply. The thing I used to find interesting about the Ragman is that, unlike some of the other homeless people in town, none of the locals ever really messed with him. Guys like Top Hat Steve and Fat Gary would eat endless shit from drunks, cowards, and teenagers alike, all groups who share a need to physically establish their place in the hierarchy by enacting violence on those least able to fight back. Some of them eventually killed Fat Gary, whose heart couldn't take the chase he was put through during his last night on Earth, or the beating he received to cap it off. To no one's surprise, our illustrious sheriff never bothered with an investigation. To people like that, Gary barely existed. Strangely, though, less than 2 weeks after his brutalized body was found in a copse of trees, 2 deputies hung themselves in their garages, neither of them leaving behind a note. Byron McElvey, whose dad John was the town coroner, snuck some of the photos he'd taken of the scene out for us to look at during our free period. I regretted it right away because of the eyes, which were bloodshot and bulging so far out of the sockets you half expected them to roll away. Still, I didn't want the other guys to think I was a sissy and looked at every photograph Byron passed around. It was in the final 2 that I caught something none of my friends had. Each deputy's light blue uniform shirt had been tugged out of their pants during the act of hanging, and even in the poorly lit Polaroids, I could see both were missing a single square of fabric at the hem. As if an unspoken agreement had been made, Fat Gary's death marked the end of violence towards our homeless population until I was in my final semester of high school. Our town is a hockey town, and that year it was our turn to host regionals, an event that would bring a couple thousand extra kids, parents, and officials to our streets. Business people and fans were thrilled with this, whereas everyone else planned to batten down the hatches until the whole thing blew over. As expected, it was bedlam, with out-of-town hockey players running riot, stealing booze from Abe's liquor and groping whoever couldn't outrun them. Needless to say, they weren't part of Gary's crowd, and I'll never forget the night I saw a group of green and white jerseyed players from Kemmerer catch sight of the Ragman as he made his rounds. They put a hurt on him that should have ended in at least a ride in an ambulance, if not a hearse. Instead, once their fists and boots were exhausted, the bored jocks drifted away to cause mayhem elsewhere, and Ragman stood right back up. He watched them go, rubbing a gloved hand across his blood-smeared face, mashing the red and black sludge into his already matted beard. I was always a small kid, and the only thing speaking out would have accomplished is giving them someone new to direct their aggression towards. Even without that, something told me to stay away. It was how I imagined it felt to be a Discovery Channel photographer recording a gazelle as it wanders away from its pack, knowing full well that ugliness was soon to follow. When nothing seemed to happen, I inwardly seethed, wanting there to be some kind of justice done. I needn't have worried. On their way home, the Kemmerer team bus went off the highway up in Kingman Pass and rolled the whole way down the ravine before bursting into flames. That stretch of blacktop is about as far away from a fire station as you can get around here without going directly up into the sky, so there was no way for any kind of help to reach them in time. The bus burned to its frame. Not a single player survived. As for the Ragman, he carried on, pushing his cart full of trash to and from downtown like clockwork, his patched jacket blowing behind him. If you hadn't been there that night or seen what I had in those photographs, you might never know what to look for. But I did. The next time Ragman pushed that squeaky wagon past my house, I ran out to watch, screen door banging behind me. My eyes crawled over every inch of him, trying to find my prize, and coming up empty. My curiosity won out over my caution. For the first time ever, I called out to him, "Ragman!" He stopped moving. Silently, the Ragman turned and locked eyes with me, his gaze so empty I could have been staring down a well. Then, one gloved hand peeled his heavy jacket away from a filthy shirt, revealing on its interior 3 patches cleaner than the rest. 2 of them a faded light blue and a third of green and white. The Ragman gave me a cold smile, so wide it revealed his teeth, far too many of them, brown and sharpened to a point. He brought a single finger to his mouth. Shh.
Subject: The Notebook. User, ADIFI. Posted, March 30th, 1997.
It used to be you never had to worry about getting robbed around here. Millbank was a small enough town, everyone knew their neighbors, and there was some accountability for the bad things you did. Well, at least the ones you did outside your house. Once that ski hill development went through, all bets were off. Then someone could take your satchel from you on the bus and run for it without anyone stopping them. If that sounds particularly specific, it's because that's how it happened for me. In the immediate aftermath, I was frantic. What was I gonna do? How could I get the satchel back? While the thought of having to spend a couple weeks replacing my ID and credit cards was distressing, that's not what had me twisted up in knots. No, it was the loss of the notebook that did that, because in the wrong hands, it might be the deadliest weapon on Earth. It wasn't always this way. The notebook started life like any other nondescript piece of stationery on a shelf in Office Max. My impetus to buy it was that I decided the time had come to act on one of my oldest impulses, toyed with in my 20s, then ignored during the decade that followed. I wanted to be a writer. Of course, nowadays, you don't need a paper and pen to be a writer. There's a whole world of word processors and computers making it easier than ever before to get thoughts out of your head into the world. I'd like to think I started out the old-fashioned way out of some allegiance to the past, but really, it was the lingering doubts about my ability to stick with this new venture, and a pad of paper gathering dust was less likely to attract attention from my girlfriend Sandy than was an entire Hewlett-Packard. Initially, I was surprised at how rigorously I kept to my writing schedule. 2 hours after breakfast every day, rain or shine, and you know what? Not only did I enjoy it, I actually got better. Even Sandy, who is notoriously not a reader, started to ask if she could read my pages when I was done. Whole worlds seemed to flow out of me, populated by people and creatures I would never have given myself credit for being able to come up with. Some were darker than others, to be sure, monsters which were as horrible to think about as they would no doubt be to behold, but even their creation felt as natural as breathing. Then, a strange thing happened. I stopped wanting to write in the notebook. There was no clear reason behind it. It was just like a kill switch had been flipped in my mind, one directly tied to creative output. For months afterward, it gathered dust the way I'd been afraid it would. Sandy's requests to see my new pages came less often, eventually stopping altogether. There was one big difference between not writing after the notebook and not writing before it. Once I had it and knew what I was capable of, an enormous amount of guilt came from not picking up the pen. You might be saying, why didn't you just do it then? Which is not far off the questions Sandy began to lob my way after a disastrous Valentine's Day where my sulky mood torpedoed what should have been a beautiful dinner at Belle Marie. Finally, one night as a spring storm raged outside, I did just that. Forced myself to dust off the notebook and crack it open. For the last month, an idea had been brewing, one about a particularly venomous African baboon tarantula, fat and black, its carapace enclosure in a teenage boy's bedroom, skittering into the shadows to wait furious until it could take revenge on its jailer. Opening the notebook seems to have been the hard work because from that point, words began to flow the way they had before. My spider stalked through the darkened house, drawing back at distant footsteps, their approach signaled by the tiny vibrating hairs on its thick legs. It patiently explored the home's layout, becoming comfortable in its many rooms and the spaces which connected them, both those through which the humans wandered and those much too small to attract their attention. Finally, after waiting for hours, the spider felt a vibration which it knew signified the teenager's footsteps. Softly, silently, the arachnid scuttled across the living room to a plush couch its target had just sunken into. A dull, flickering blue light from the television did nothing to peel back the dim, leaving plenty of cover for the tiny assassin to work. It tapped over to the boy's socked feet where his jeans had ridden up, exposing his Achilles tendon. Tentatively, one hairy leg brushed against the bare skin, then a second. The boy seemed not to notice. Satisfied, the spider began climbing the rough denim around his leg, tiny claws hooking into the fabric as it gradually scaled him until it reached the couch's seat. Once there, it scooted under a blanket and laid across its former captor's lap. Now, feeling its way to his torso, carefully avoiding bare skin lest he'd be alerted. It needn't have worried, as the teenager had been out getting high with friends and was only barely awake. Whatever remaining attention he had invested completely into the infomercial playing out in front of him. Seeming to sense this cluelessness the closer it got, the spider sped up its approach, burrowing further and further up the blanket until it burst from cover, sinking its comparatively large fangs into the teenager's jugular vein. A single bite from a king baboon tarantula, painful and fever-inducing though it may be, isn't enough to kill a human being. Multiple doses of venom directly into the bloodstream is another matter entirely, and the stoned teenager barely had time to rise to his feet, screaming before my pen, which had been practically dancing across the notebook's lined page, stopped at the terrified scream which seemed to be coming from my living room, followed a moment later by a heavy thump. Sandy had been watching TV in there. I called out her name. No response. The notebook forgotten. I rose to my feet and opened the office door, hearing Letterman's monologue echo down the short corridor. I'm a habitual creature of the dark and don't know what possessed me to turn on the overhead lamp in just that moment, but when I did, its harsh white light caused the huge black spider pelting toward me to stop in its tracks. Instinct, older than civilization itself, sent a signal to my leg, and before I knew what I was doing, one of my wingtips came crashing down, crushing the arachnid with a sickening crunch. When I drew back my foot, my eyes were drawn to the yellow line across its ruined body. I called out Sandy's name again, hearing only the tinny laughter of Dave's audience in response. She was dead, of course, her fallen joint burning a hole in the sofa, blood cascading down into the neckline of her blouse from where a ragged hole had been sawed into the flesh. I was numb, as if I'd stepped through the office door into a nightmare, the unreality of it all heightened by the TV's flickering half-light. When police questioned me about what happened, I had enough self-preservation instinct, not to mention having written a story which mirrored the night's events. There was suspicion, to be sure, but no one was imaginative enough to think I could have somehow found a tarantula of that size and trained it to do exactly what it had done. It was a ludicrous idea, yet in terms of sheer incredulity, it paled in comparison to what had actually happened. Once Sandy's body had been removed, a single black ring on the sofa fabric was the only proof she'd ever been there at all. Back in my office, I sagged into the chair and looked listlessly at my bare desk. With a heavy breath, I opened the drawer where I'd hastily hidden the notebook after calling an ambulance and pulled it out. To look at it, it appeared to be exactly the same as it always had, like any other piece of cheap stationery. I knew better. Opening its cover, I half expected the tarantula alive and full of furious vitality to spring from its pages. Instead, only my own words looked back at me accusingly. In desperation, I found myself scrawling hopeful phrases in the space immediately after the teenage boy's death. None of this really happened. It was only a dream. All to no effect whatsoever. That's when the enormity of what happened truly dawned on me, and I cried for Sandy. It felt like I'd never stop. Since then, several months have passed. Experimentation has proven the events of that night to be no fluke. Stories written in the notebook have an unfortunate habit of coming true. The catch is that you can't simply wish for things, you have to write them compellingly into being. I've conjured a sunset so red it looked as though the sky was bleeding, and a cuckoo clock which appears to be counting down, though to what, I couldn't say, as it only speaks a language known to inhabitants of this earth who, long ago, retreated to the sea. Knowing what the notebook is capable of, I always keep it close, never leaving home without its comforting weight in my satchel, and I've never stopped writing in it, not for a day, especially after learning exactly how it worked. I had a plan, you see, a story that would set everything back the way it should be, returning Sandy to me. I was so close to the finish line, then the bag was ripped from my shoulder, its thief vanishing off the bus into a crowd. I have to find it before they understand what it can do, before my beautiful story is perverted into something dark, before something much worse than a spider crawls up out of the shadows of our collective unconscious.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.